Hi guys, it's Matt here from MCS-books. Now today I'm going to do a review video about a sort of minefield of a topic. This video is going to be about race, surrealism and poetry. And the book that I'm going to be talking about is The Refusal of the Shadow, Surrealism in the Caribbean. It's a Verso edition and it's edited by Michael Richardson. This book for me was a very powerful book, and I genuinely believe that this is a book that many people should read. There are very few reviews of it on Goodreads, and I believe this is important, and it's an important part of Black history. Now, this video is going to be talking about race and racial oppression and the Own Voices movement. And I understand that this can be a very sensitive topic, and I'm going to try to be as sensitive as possible whilst discussing it. But I feel I need to discuss it in relation to this book because it made such an impact on my understanding of racial relations in our current society, but also it gave me a much more thorough understanding of Caribbean history and racial movements within the Caribbean and how it has paved a way in some sense for people in our current time to express themselves in a certain way. So I read this book for fun, thinking it was going to be a nice, interesting way to see how surrealism was used around the world. But from this book, I gained so much more. Now, I'm not saying that by reading this book, I am now an expert. I will not in any way deny people's experiences, people's voices. I am just going to express my opinion of some racial matters and Western thought that kind of solely focus on this book, because I don't want to stray too far away from this book because I might get into territory where I don't know enough about. However, I do want to preface this video with, these were my interpretations from this book, my understanding of difficulties that others may face, but then also I am in no way going to try to instill what I'm saying as any fact. It's just thought, okay? And it's my thought, and I'm coming from a white perspective here, so I apologise if what I say offends anybody. It shouldn't do, I hope. But if it does, please correct me and please let me know what I'm saying that is wrong, because I am listening. That's all I want to say. I am listening to others' voices, and this book has allowed me a sort of another tool to engage within the conversation that is happening all around the world currently. This book is a collection of essays from Caribbean voices who use surrealism as a sort of method to discuss their ideas, discuss their issues, and discuss their desire for change. Most of these essays are from about the 1930s and the 1940s. The ideas come from the Surrealist movement in between the First and the Second World War. The people who have written most of these essays were inspired by Andre Breton, who is a key figure in the Surrealist movement. And I went into it just wanting to see how Surrealism was used, but I came out of it with so much more than that. And this was a truly valuable read for me, and I would like to express why. Now, like I said, these essays come from the 30s and the 40s. They are coming from a very different mindset and a very different age to what we are experiencing now within the world. But these essays are still so relevant, and they're so poignant. At the time, these essays were considered quite radical, and I still think that in today's mindset, they are still quite radical, which is actually a shame because it goes to show how much hasn't changed within these years. And I feel like we could be on the cusp of something anew, something is kind of bubbling beneath the surface, and I feel like change is coming. And I would like to really promote this book as a tool for other people to kind of experience the need for this change. Now, the biggest themes of these essays are surrealism, poetry, and negritude. It's a sort of celebration of being Black, and a celebration of being Caribbean. The voices of these essays are in this state of surety as to who they are, but they're still very much caught in this colonial idea of what they are. They are very much entrenched in this idea that they are the Caribbean, they are representatives, they are shrouded in what it means to be Caribbean, but they are also so influenced by their history that they are African, and how it's kind of been suppressed out of them, which is just heartbreaking, because they want this culture that they feel they've in a way been denied, and this sense of identity that in one hand they are so sure of who they are, of what their voices are, of what they want, what they need, and their place in the world. And yet the other side of their identity, which has been forced upon them, is that they don't in a way feel complete, because they've been denied their homeland of Africa. They've been given a country that wasn't originally theirs, and that they are forced to be lesser within their own home. And I feel like it really encapsulates what it means to be kind of othered within your own home country. And it's such a powerful feeling that I got from this essay, because of course I've been privileged enough not to experience that. Surrealism didn't end up being as prevalent throughout this text as I thought it was going to be, but it was in a way very implicit. Surrealism for these voices is a tool that they use to be themselves. And a contemporary understanding of surrealism might be kind of like, if I say surreal to you, you might just imagine Dali, his work of just strange dreamscape images and things that don't quite make sense or aren't quite real, but kind of like in a way true at the same time. We have this idea of what surrealism could be, but it's so much more as a tool. And what is really sad is the way that surrealism was used as a tool by these voices. For them, surrealism wasn't about blurring the boundaries of dream and reality. It wasn't about creating surrealist landscapes and images of things that could never really be real. For them, surrealism was a tool to allow themselves to imagine a world where they are equal. And for me, that is such a heartbreaking thought, that in order for them to kind of allow themselves to be equal, they have to use surrealism, which of course then suggests that there is no reality in black people being equal, which of course is true. You look at it today, this was in the 30s and 40s, you look at it today and in so many countries, black people are not treated equally. How scary is that these voices have to use surrealism to view the world as equals? It should be realism. It should be a real fact. It should be our reality, not a surrealist imagining of something that could be. It was never very explicit, but it was always present. It really made me see that my reality, I like to think I will make every effort to treat everyone equally regardless of race. That's a reality to me, but within the world itself, that's a surrealist's imagining of what could be. And it's not there, and it's not that, but it should be. It's not an exotic alternative. It should be our reality. So reading this as a surrealist text kind of gave it such a heartbreaking feeling throughout. Another part that comes up from that is the concept of globalization, which they begin to mention here. Now, of course, the people that were writing this story were predominantly from Martinique. It was a French colony. It was French at the time. So these people were constantly in battle, trying to find their place while being repressed by the French, but they were also so close to America. So they kind of had this strange understanding of the world where they can see it for what it is. When we use words like globalization, what we talk about is westernization. It's not globalization at all. It's westernization of the world, and it's the colonialism that they talk about in here that affects them every day. They then go on to explain how we are not beyond a colonialist time. Globalization is our new colonization. Globalization is all about forcing the Western ideal on the world and expecting people to assimilate. And this idea of assimilation is something that is so detestable to the voices of these stories, but it's so real, it's so true, is that you have to assimilate to the world, and you have to assimilate to things to bodies that are beyond your own. And that's something that's something I want to talk about a bit later on. So the other thing, very important in this essay, or in this collection of essays, is poetry. Now, when I first started reading this, they kept on talking about poetry a lot. And actually, what's really nice about these essays are that they are poetic, they are literary, they are not hardcore academic essays. They are beautiful, they use language that is just so rich and so wonderful. And I really think the translators did such a good job in translating this. However, I was kind of a bit confused at first as to why these people were talking about poetry so much and why was poetry so important to them. And then halfway through, like, they never once explained. They were just talking about poetry as it was important. There wasn't the need for them to explain why, because halfway through it dawned on me, for these voices, poetry was the only form within which they could be heard. At the time that a lot of these writers were writing, and a lot of them did write poetry also, there was heavy censorship within their country. There were things that they just simply couldn't say. There was the promotion of negritude was not something that was allowed within a predominantly black country. So they took to poetry, because within poetry, you are allowed to use metaphors. And once you use metaphors, you can say something, but using the language of something else. So you can say a feeling, a power, a need for power, by shrouding it in metaphor, by giving it another image, which still evokes the same feeling. And it is those metaphors and images that were allowed to pass the censorship. But also what was important to these people was what they didn't say within their poetry. Everyone was aware of the censorship. Everyone was aware of what could and couldn't be said. When these voices were using poetry, they were very explicit in what they were not saying. And for these people, what wasn't being said was more important than what was being said. What was being said between the lines, what was missed, and what did that mean? They were allowed to express themselves and their feelings through poetry because that would get them past the censors, that would allow them to be published. It could also be done story format, in books, in essays, like these essays that are being written, but it couldn't. They were still a part of the French colony. And France has a rich history of literature and writings and essays and everything. And were these voices to write in these formats, they would forever be deemed pale imitations of what was French. And it would just be a joke that somebody who was black was trying to imitate French culture and failing miserably, that they were trying to be something that they were not. And this also held power to the people who were writing, because they didn't want to assimilate. They didn't want to be French, they wanted to be Caribbean, they wanted to be Martinican, they wanted to be themselves and black, and they wanted to be proud of that. And so poetry was their way of getting into that. And when this dawned on me, it kind of gave me goosebumps, because it was how heartbreaking that poetry was the only form of hope. Poetry was the only form of rebellion. Poetry was the only form that they could be heard within. And us of the Western world took ownership of every other writing format and just didn't allow anyone else to break into ours. But these essays here very much really solidifies why poetry was so important to these voices. So now I kind of want to then talk a little bit about the importance of own voices. What's special about these texts being own voices is the people within it are angry. They're angry because for so much history they've never been allowed their own voice. They have been silenced, whether it be through explicit censorship or whether it be through the mocking of them trying to enjoy someone else's culture. They have been silenced, and they're angry because that silence has destroyed any possibility of them having their own cultural voice. So what I mean by that is that through this oppression, through this colonization, through this assimilation, something that these voices are angry about is the people who then produce work that isn't Caribbean or it isn't African, it is Western. There seems to be no other option. They have lost their voices through years and years of oppression and illiteracy. They talk about a time that, their languages weren't even written languages, they were only spoken languages. And through the act of publishing and globalization, because their spoken languages were not written, they were lost, and so their cultural voice was lost. That their voices that they were writing with and being published with were very much Western voices. And so it makes me think now about globalization in its current state as another form of colonization, as westernization, and why own voices is so important. There's the possibility for these writers to begin to express their own cultures once again without having to assimilate to Western ideals. However, I do think about it, and in one way, there is no other way of getting around the boundaries that have been historically put in place other than assimilating. So I do worry that perhaps own voice texts have gone through this process of assimilation, but I do believe that it's a necessary step. It's not a great step, it's a sad step that has to be gone through, because only then, and once own voice texts have been given the space that they deserve, only then can their own cultural language begin to evolve in its own way, to evolve in a way that isn't westernized, to go back to its roots and to become its own entity and not just a Western entity. An important thing to think about when we talk about own voices within publishing is that when a book is being championed as an own voice representation, it is still, that championing is coming from a Western or a westernized or a white perspective. And again, I don't feel I have the right to have much of an opinion on this, but it's something that I want to be aware of in thinking, and I still believe again that it's a very necessary step. It's a very unfortunate step that has to be taken, but I feel it is a necessary step to be in the position when finally self-exotification doesn't have to happen. And I think that's just such a sad reality that we live in, that's a necessary step. I don't really have any final parting words of any ideas that have been solidified, but these texts have made me so much more aware of things that perhaps I wasn't before. I believe it's such a necessary book to read for everyone. This book really blew me away, and there is one particular passage that I would like to end this video on. It gave me goosebumps to read it. So this passage is from April 1941, and the writer is Aimé Césaire. It's titled Presentation. A silent and sterile land. I'm speaking about ours, and my hearing measures by the Caribbean Sea the terrifying silence of man. Europe, Africa, Asia. I hear screaming still, drum beats in the bush, temples praying amidst the banyan trees. And I know it is man speaking, now, as always, and I am listening. But here is the monstrous atrophy of the voice, the age-old exhaustion, the incredible mutism. No city, no art, no poetry, no civilization, at least in its true sense, meaning that projection of man onto the world, the modelling of the world by man, that stamp of man's effigy on the universe. A death more frightful than death, where the living drift. And it is elsewhere that science progresses, elsewhere that philosophies are renewed, elsewhere that aesthetics succeed each other, and in vain that on this our land the hand sows seeds. No city, no art, no poetry, not one seed, not one shoot, or else the hideous leprosy of imitations. In truth, a sterile and silent land. But it is no longer the time to feed off the world. Rather, it is a question of saving it. The time has come to grind our loins like valiant men. Wherever we look, the shadow is encroaching. One after the other, the home fires are extinguished. The circle of shadows close in amid the cries of men and the howls of beasts. Yet we are the kind who refuse the shadow. We know that the world's salvation depends on us too, that the land needs its sons, no matter who they be. The humblest, the shadow encroaches. All the hope in the world would not be enough to look at the century in the face. Strong-willed men will make a new light for this world. It was just such a powerful powerful expert. It kind of gave me goosebumps when I read it. And I feel like it really defines everything that I've been trying to say that I have learned from these texts. I hope that I have been able to express myself in a positive way. I hope that I have been able to articulate my ideas well, but if I have said anything that doesn't sit comfortably with you, let's talk about it. Let's discuss it. I'm open and I'm ready to listen, and I want to know your opinions also on what makes own voice work, as important as it is. Thank you, and I'll see you next time for another video. Bye bye.